Hello, brothers and sisters. It's me, Franklin Jones, the author of The Black Matrix. For some time now, I've been posting articles and videos, but my mission, the goal is to elevate the minds of our people from biblical fairy tales and silly slave syndrome myths so that we can gain a true and accurate understanding of our plight and condition. Because if our understandings remain flawed, then all liberating remedies that stem from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. This is why the goal here is to teach our people the truth. When the blatant systems of white racism used in the past, such as the segregation laws in the US or the apartheid law in South Africa, resulted in unprecedented unified black protests and became no longer socially acceptable with the changing times, white oppressive forces start deploying social sciences against black people. Social sciences are the science dedicated to human behavior, particularly how people interact with each other, how people behave, and how people develop as a culture. When the blatant methods of racism became no longer acceptable, the white society started deploying these tactics against us. And they're going to continue to do so until we elevate our minds and understand it and then develop counter strategies against it. For example, there is a term called cultural stupidity. It's a culture filled with idiotic ideologies. Now, I'm going to tell you how this works because we are the worst victims of it. Cultural stupidity is when those in power, those in position of power, who controls the images and narratives that a targeted population receives, constantly feeds idiotic ideologies to the targeted population. Those among the targeted population, those who are the most naive, gullible, and ignorant, accept the idiotic ideologies and start repeating it. Those in power then gives those ones of us who are naive, gullible, and ignorant a national media platform so they can spread the ignorant ideology. Now the ignorant ideology is now being spread from black faces. Now while they're doing this, those among the targeted population, those who are intelligent, critical thinkers, those who are against the idiotic ideologies are not given a national platform. So this creates a scenario where there's a one-sided flow of information of idiotic ideologies. And this allows the idiotic ideologies to prevail, creating a culture that believes idiotic ideologies. And this is what's being done to us. This is why millions of African Americans insist that we made the N-word ours, and calling ourselves niggers empowers us. It's an idiotic ideology. But we're not hearing the other voice that's against it. It's why people are sagging their pants below their asses, calling out women bitches and hoes. It's why we think that calling ourselves thugs is empowering. We think we glamorize pimps. There's a war being waged against us that most of our people don't understand. When you condition a man to routinely call women bitches and hoes and to glamorize pimps, which is a profession that degrades a woman in the worst way, we are beginning to subconsciously devalue our women. When they condition a black man to call himself nigger, they're diffusing the alpha males among us. The alpha males are the blacks who are inherently wired to protect their communities and to protect the women, the feminine spirit. But when you condition a black man to perceive himself as a nigger, he's now wired to perceive himself through an inferior identity that makes him less likely to defend his community. When he's made to perceive his people as a bunch of niggers, he's also less likely to fight and defend his people. If he values his woman as a bitch or a hoe and he glamorizes pimps, he's less likely to defend his woman because subconsciously his mind has been turned against his own people. This is the war that's been waged against us and we don't understand it. And we have to wake up in order to liberate ourselves. Now, the fact that words have power over the subconscious mind. Words, when repeated often enough, shapes our biology. This is the reason why a man who calls himself a thug is more likely to engage in a fight than to avoid one. It's why women who proclaim themselves as being bitches often become stubbornly unreasonable. Also, by assigning words onto others, it allows you to dehumanize them. It makes it easier to mistreat them. Proof of this is shown in the military. To ease soldiers' anxieties during the Vietnam War and the Korean War about torturing the Asian soldiers, they taught them to call them chinks, gooks. They assigned these negative words upon them, and when you assign negative words onto them, it became easier to torture them. There's a covert war being waged against our minds, and we have no true leaders to speak about the war that's being waged against our minds. This is not some feeble-minded premise, an attempt to scapegoat by blaming white people for our own failures, our own shortcomings, as so many have been programmed to believe. It's a social science. We are victims of social engineering. We, African Americans, are more susceptible to negative social engineering because we've been stripped of our culture and identity. Here's a scientific fact. Those who control the people's media images control their culture. Because most people think that the media reflects our reality, but the truth is most people imitate how they see themselves depicted in the media. People become those derogatory media depictions of themselves that they accept as being their reality. It's a true hidden science called media social engineering. The reason why African Americans call ourselves niggers is because of media social engineering. During the 1960s, African Americans, we started giving ourselves African names. We started wearing afros. We started demonstrating our love for Mother Africa. Now our culture has changed to a point where millions of us now prefer to be called a nigger than an African. We have been socially engineered away from our African roots. This also makes us weaker as a people. Social scientists determined that African Americans' allegiance towards Africa hindered our allegiance from growing toward the U.S. government. So they started a propaganda campaign to devalue Africa in our minds. This is why we're always seeing the poorest and the worst part of Africa, because through repetition, it makes us believe that the enslavement of our ancestors benefited us. So it makes us feel indebted to the white man for enslaving our ancestors. It also makes us embarrassed of our African heritage. So now many of us would rather be called anything other than African. We must understand the war against our minds. And they condition us to call ourselves niggers. And every so often they propagate all these sound-alike words, these words that are derivative of the word nigger. Those words are actually designed to keep us calling ourselves niggers, therefore keep us functioning from an inferior position. For example, they say one of those propaganda campaigns is the word niggers, N-E-G-U-S. So they said we should call ourselves niggers because it means king. Here are the facts, okay? There are over 3,000 languages in Africa, and each of those languages have at least 3 to 4 words meaning king, ruler, so on. Now, when you have that many thousands of words meaning king in Africa, don't you see how absurd it is to believe that the only one that's being spread to us is the word niggas, the one that sounds like nigger? We must stop being so gullible and naive. The word niggers is being used to keep us functioning under the word of niggers because the subconscious mind doesn't see the different spelling. If for so many years we were conditioned to know shit as something negative, and you start calling people shit, or you name a child shit, and with a made-up narrative, you're going to destroy his self-esteem calling him shit. Because the subconscious mind knows the true and original narrative of the word, which is a derogatory one. We have to stop being gullible and understand that our culture is being negatively steered by white oppressive forces. This propaganda program, now I want you to think for a second. Back to the 1960s. In the 1960s, we were calling ourselves brothers and sisters, and we were more unified. And we called white people crackers, honkies. Now today, we're calling ourselves niggers and bitches and calling them white people. Is it not clear to you that we've been socially engineered to respect ourselves less and to respect them more? In the 1960s, we agreed that our worst enemies were the white oppressive forces. Now, today, millions of us insist that we are our own worst enemies. It's always by design whenever the oppressed starts thinking exactly as the oppressors wants them to. Throughout history, the perceptions and thoughts held by the oppressed are never truly theirs. They are the ideologies that serve the interests of the oppressors that has been indoctrinated into the minds of the oppressed without them realizing it. We have to recognize that we're not being controlled by silly slave syndrome myth, which present what would be the least effective method used to control a generation of people. We are being controlled by the white society's ongoing monopoly over information that we receive. There are 4 ways to manipulate the human brain: by what we're taught, by what we see, by what we hear, and through repetition. The white society exploits their monopoly over the education we're taught, the media images we see, the societal narrative that we repeatedly hear to manipulate our minds to think in ways that serve the interests of the white society. This is the true reason why many black people now perceive ourselves as being our own worst enemies and revere Caucasians, in spite of a brutal history to the contrary. Now, here's the fact. Those black people who say they insist that we are our own worst enemy, they say they insist based upon their own experience, are actually delusional, because it's not humanly possible for any individual to assess the collective state of millions of people based upon their own individual experiences. It's not humanly possible. Black people walks around with these negative assessments of ourselves because these negative assessments have been embedded into our mind by the white society, who controls all of our narratives. They control our study results, our statistics. Now, come on, critically think. Can you not see how cartoonishly unrealistic it actually is? That virtually all information that we receive from the white society favor themselves over us? Think. What's happening is, through repetition, it is designed to program our minds. White social scientists describe this as instilling a value system into the collective minds of the subordinate population that makes us more compliant with the dominant group's dominance over our lives. It makes us adhere to the authority of the dominant culture. This is how the white society dealt with the 1968 Black Revolt. This is how they did it. They removed our true leaders. They replaced them with puppet leaders. These puppet leaders worked for the white establishment. Now they bombard us with information, with misinformation that is designed to keep our collective aggression shifted away from the white society and redirected against us. To give you more of a detail now, many of us heard of the Kerner Commission when they did a study on the African American population. But you must remember that some of the information from that Kerner report that you're looking at has been classified. Okay? So you're not hearing everything. You're only hearing what the government wants you to hear. You're not hearing the remedy. But here are some of the facts that the government don't want you to know. The Kerner Commission hired social scientists to thoroughly study the African American community, to learn our weaknesses, to learn our strengths, and then to attack our strengths and to exploit our weakness. They also determined that an aggravating factor for the unprecedented Black protests during the 60s was an elevated and unifying Black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of the Black Pride movement. They also determined that Black collective aggressions, due to our long-term oppression under whites, had grown so much that it's resulted in Black revolt. They determined that whenever the oppressed are oppressed for a long time, their collective aggressions will grow until rebellion becomes inevitable. This is what was happening in the 1960s. So what they discovered is, they say, logically, they say what they have to do is lower the Black collective self-esteem. This is why all of our narratives are negative, negative, negative. It keeps our collective self-esteem low. The reason why we're constantly hearing about black on black crime, black on black crime, black on black crime, because it shifts our collective aggressions away from the white society and redirects against ourselves. This is what's being happening to us, and this is what they determined from the Kerner report. Now, in terms of exploiting our weaknesses and attacking our greatest strength, they also determined that Black unity was our greatest strength. This is why Black people, we pull off the greatest, most successful unified protest in U.S. history. Okay, so what they decided they can do, they said they had to erode black unity. Therefore, they attack our strength unrelentingly. This is why we're constantly hearing that we're the worst enemies. We are worst enemies. We are worst enemies. We're constantly being made to believe less about ourselves. They also determined our greatest weakness was the fact that we were stripped of our true identity and culture. This makes us more susceptible to negative media social engineering. They control our media images and they can steer us, tell us who we are. When we're watching the movies, they're telling us how black people are supposed to act, how black people are supposed to dress, and we're imitating it. They're covertly steering our culture. We must wake up to this reality. We must wake up to this reality so we can then develop proper counter strategies. Calling ourselves niggas does not empower us. Calling our women bitches and hoes does not empower our women. Sagging our pants below our asses, conducting ourselves in self-deprecating behavior, and we've normalized it. Then they create those false propaganda that the sagging pants come out of the prison industry. That's total bullshit. When men leave from the prison industry who have engaged in homosexuality, most try to conceal that from their family. They don't return back to their communities flaunting the fact that they had been having sex with men. When they return from it, they do not promote it. So the narrative that it was the prison system, no. The reason why many black men sag, because it was placed in the media, placed in music videos as something cool and trendy. Black men saw the image and imitated it because it was cool and trendy. It's who we are. It's how we dress. We must elevate our minds and understand that there are social sciences. There are propaganda tactics. We're being steered. And the oppressor's greatest weapon is black ignorance of the social science that's being used against us. There are many social science. They work unrelentingly behind the scenes, shaping our minds to serve the system of white supremacy. I will give you one more example. Many of us know it's a fact that we're learning more black racially affirming fact from each other on social media than we do so within our schools. We know this to be a fact. But do you know that's a social science? It's a social science. Because in order for a dominant group to maintain its position of social dominance, the education taught to the subordinate group must deny them of a racially affirming curriculum. When the subordinate group is denied a racially affirming curriculum, this psychology conditions them to accept their subordinate status within the society. These are all social sciences. There's even a social science why they depict the Egyptians as being Caucasians. This is social science. According to white social science, a people's self-image and a people's future aspiration is nurtured by what they're taught to believe about themselves. And it doesn't matter if what they're being taught is untrue. All that matters is that people believe is true. So the ancient history we've been taught has been whitewashed to bolster the self-image and to inspire the future aspirations of Caucasians at the expense of Africans. Here is the science, the proof. Carbon date testing on ancient Egypt has scientifically proven that the ancient kingdoms were built thousands of years before the European Greeks and the Arabs arrived there during the 7th century. When they're digging up the bodies of these mummies, those mummies were buried thousands of years before any Arab or Caucasian was there. They were Africans. DNA analysis have scientifically proven that they were Africans. But see, we're not hearing these facts. We're being taught what is called Orwellian propaganda. It distorts facts to exalt whites. Social science also has found that in order for a dominant group to maintain their position of dominance, the narratives that are fed into a society must exalt the dominant culture. Doing so endorses their position of dominance. The white society is falsely scripted to serve the system of white supremacy. And we function based upon those distorted narratives. People do not function based on facts nor reality. People function based upon the prevailing narratives. Those in power create these false narratives, impose them upon society, and they're empowered by those false narratives. I'll give you one last example. The narrative. Now, here's the fact. Every man comes from the womb of a woman. This is scientific fact. This is fact. But they created the narrative that the first woman came from the rib of a man at the request of a man to be the helpmate of a man. And they imposed that narrative through religion onto billions. And we function based upon that narrative, making women into inherent subordinates. Women are subordinate sex because of that narrative, because they come second, they come from us. Now, that's not true at all. But because people believe that narrative, people function based upon it. People do not function based upon true. They function based on their perception of what's true. This is why social science says perception is more important than reality for controlling people, because people function based upon their perceptions rather than what's true. So the white society creates false narratives that perpetuates the myth of white racial superiority. And it empowers them. It creates false assumptions within the society that aids in maintaining white dominance. For example, we are functioning based upon the fact that most inventions that revolutionized the world were invented by Caucasians, and that black people are the least of society who haven't invented much throughout history. And our contributions are limited to sports and rap music, when the hidden reality is that most inventions that revolutionized the world were in fact either invented by black people or were inspired by early inventions by black people. But see, these are not the narratives you're hearing. You're hearing white versions of false narratives, and we function based upon them. In order for black people to liberate ourselves, we must elevate our minds above a biblical fairy tale and a Willie Lynch myth, which are actually designed to distract us from the truth. We must learn that there are social sciences, and we're being constantly manipulated to think in ways that serve and protect the system of white supremacy. This is what we must learn. Please learn it. Share the videos. Please. I have a page on www.theblackpeoplesmatrix.com. Order my books, but if you don't have to, but just learn the information, learn the knowledge, and share it. This is how we liberate ourselves. This is how we elevate ourselves. If we wake up now and eradicate their lies, we place ourselves in a position to save future generations of Africans who aren't even born yet from mental slavery. We must push against their lies. We must eradicate the culture of stupidity that exists among our communities because of our white oppressive forces. And we must continue to push truth. One love and peace, my brothers and sisters. One love and peace.